And so this thought of peace and joy and happiness that you hear in the church, and even that you hear in the 12-step program, was so foreign to me. I didn't know what that meant, and I surely didn't know what it felt like. But I'll tell you, when that lightning bolt went straight through me, I can't explain why, but I can explain how it felt. And literally speaking, for 3 days, I felt the deepest sense of joy and peace and serenity that I have ever felt in my entire life. And physically speaking, it felt like my feet were never touching the ground.
Hello everyone, my name is Joe Pusateri and I'm living the sober life. And I'm here on location at the General Assembly of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ of United States and Canada. As you know, I'm a minister in a Disciples Christ church, and so this is the assembly that I come to every couple years. It's in Des Moines this time, it's in different places around the country. But anyway, I thought I'd do some podcasting while I'm here. And I have a special guest with me today. This is someone that I've met here at the assembly. This is Stephen. And we really connected. He's also a person in recovery, and we've had a lot of great conversation, and we thought we'd share some of that conversation with you. So would you like to introduce yourself and tell folks who you are?
Thanks for having me, Joey. I appreciate it.
No problem, man.
And I appreciate meeting you here at General Assembly. My name is Stephen Yorba Patten. I am pastor of Urban Mission, a small congregation in South Pomona, which is a city that's about 30 miles east of Los Angeles.
Okay.
Small urban community. We have a small congregation in a church that was established over 100 years ago in the Mexican community at the time. We've also established a nonprofit that runs alongside the church to help us further our social ministries in the community. So,
awesome. Tell me, what brought you into ministry? What was your draw, your passion that pulled you in?
Well, I was raised in the church, and so always had church in my blood. I think somewhere in my teens and my 20s, I kind of left the church altogether. My late 20s, I kind of had a spiritual awakening, spiritual experience that for the first time I had the notion of that I wanted to be a minister, or that I wanted to be a pastor. And that was the first time I had that thought. And so that kind of stayed in the back of my mind. I did work in the church just as a lay leader, and then went into education and saw that as my vocation. And I've been
a school teacher, or what?
A school teacher, yeah,
okay.
Mostly high school education. So I've been a high school educator for about 25 years, and I see that as my vocation. And I always saw that as a way of living out my call. And so that call to active ministry as a pastor, clergy, kind of stayed there on the back burner while I was living out this call as an educator. Somewhere in my early to mid 40s, though, that call to ministry came back. I had kind of re-entered the church after I'd been married and had my son. I had my son, and I thought, well, how am I going to raise this child in terms of religion? How do I want to raise him, and what kind of church would I want to raise him in? What kind of theology would I want him to have connection to? And so I found my way back to the United Church of Christ, and it was actually there that I met a couple pastors that spoke to me directly about a future in ministry. And at the time, I was kind of exploring it in the back of my mind. And so there was this kind of connection between what I was thinking and what they were saying to me. They saw something in me. And so I really had to think about that. And the call got larger and larger couple of years, and then I finally decided, you know what, I think I've had this notion of a call to be a pastor for a long time, going all the way back to that religious experience that I had in my late 20s. It's time that I complete that exploration. And so I decided to go to seminary.
What was the spiritual experience like? Describe that to me, because I find those fascinating. I've had experiences that I would describe as spiritual awakenings, but
Yep.
I always love to hear the stories others can tell.
Yeah, so the spiritual awakening, that comes out of the story of my disease and addiction and mental health.
Okay.
By my late 20s, 27, 28, I had reached the height of my disease, and it had left me vacant, and it had crushed my spirit. I was in my disease full blown. I experienced an overdose, a psychotic break that led me to one rehab, and then a relapse, and then another rehab that was actually in a mental institution. And I spent a year in that program, and part of it was a 90-day recovery program, hardcore, non-medical detox, 90-day program.
Did you know you were going in for a year when you started, or did that?
No, I didn't. So I had gone to this poshy kind of recovery by the insistence of my family, because I'd OD'd and everybody was worried about me, and they had the insurance, so they sent me to this kind of poshy, cushy medical detox program, and I spent a month or so in there. Went out. I think I acquired about 8 months of sobriety, and then just relapsed hardcore. Drug of choice at the time was alcohol, cocaine, speed, whatever I could get my hands on, and that just started to the big book talks about how it's a progressive disease, right? Never gets better, it always gets worse.
Right.
And in a matter of months, my disease had progressed to another level of insanity. And so I went running back to this counselor that I had in this poshy place of recovery. And he was this hardcore ex-convict, a heroin addict, really rough and gruff, been to prison, bank robberies and things like that. And he was working in this place, and he was my counselor. So I went running back to him and I said, listen, I'm going crazy out there. I can't do this. I need help. And so he just looked at me and he said, are you willing to do whatever I tell you to do? And I said, yes, I'm willing to do whatever you tell me to do. And he said, okay, good. Go home and wait for my phone call. And so I went home, and he eventually called me, and he said, I've got a place for you. You're going to Metro, and it's a place called Cider House. And I said, well, what is that? And he said, don't ask any questions. You're going there. And I said, okay. So my sister actually took me there. It was down in a city south of downtown Los Angeles in Norwalk. It happened to be a Metropolitan State Hospital, a state mental institution, and there was a rehab program in the middle of this mental institution, a state hospital. I had no idea that was the case until I woke up.
Surprise!
Surprise it was, yeah. I got loaded to the hilt before my sister came over, so I was in a blackout when I was taken there. I woke up in detox, non-medical detox, surrounded by these guys that, police. This was the kind of detox where the police would come and dump people off from the streets. These guys were bloated, they were yellow, they were puking all over the place, people in convulsions. And I woke up in that place, this young white kid, right? And I looked around, I thought, what in the world am I doing here? Where did this guy send me? And I still had no idea where I was. I just heard Cider House, I'm in this detox. And I spent several days in detox, then got out, and then got a bed in the program, which was 30 days, and then it was 60 days, then it was 90 days, and it was your basic, hardcore recovery program of circle work, and we had all of our chores. Our first chore was we had to, what was called wet sit these guys in detox.
Wet sit?
Yeah, so we had to sit in a chair next to guys that were coming into detox, and we had to clean up their barf, and we had to sit by them in case they went into seizures, grand mal seizures, delirium tremors, right? And take care of them so that they wouldn't swallow their tongue. We had to turn them on their side so they wouldn't choke on their own vomit. That was our first job.
Wow.
And then we had to, we had mopping the floors and then working in the kitchen. We graduated. And then from 90 days, we moved into kind of this transitional home that was still on the campus. So I ended up spending a year inside that campus before my counselor there said, what are you going to do? He said, here's what you're going to do. You're going to go out and you're going to go back to school. And I said, okay. So I ended up going back to college, back to junior college. But while I was in that transitional home, they had been introducing us to 12-step recovery while we were inside. That was their model of recovery. And I wanted nothing to do with it. But I was so hurt and broken that I knew I needed something, right? And so I would sit in meetings, I would sit in the back, and I would just listen. And at that time, 12-step meetings were like filled with these ragged old men, old-timers with a lot of sobriety, and they smoked and drank coffee. And you'd walk into these meetings with like this cigarette smoke, wafting in the air, and I thought, what is this? And so I sat, and I didn't really get what was going on. I didn't get how that was connected to me having ended up in this institution. And I didn't really see how that was connected to me getting well, right? But I had this guy named Tio. We called him Tio. This old Filipino guy who was actually in there recovering as well. And he was this spiritual guy, and he was full on in Jesus mode, right? And he had his guitar, and he'd walk around singing these praise songs, and always carried the Bible with him. And at that time, I had fully rejected religion. I didn't want anything to do with it. And he kept after me and after me and after me with this question of who I was, right, in relationship to the gospel and Jesus Christ. And I just fully wanted to reject that. And he was very persistent. He was very kind and gentle, and he wasn't overpowering. He just kind of put these seeds in my head. And I remember that being connected to something that I was hearing in the 12-step program, which was conceding to a power greater than yourself, right? Whatever that meant to you. And I was thinking, what does that mean? A power greater than myself, right? And I knew that the program talked about God language, and somehow spirituality. And then I had Tio, on the other hand, talking to me about Jesus Christ, right? Saves. And so I started to make this connection, right? About perhaps there is something greater than myself that I can offer myself to that will help me. And so I took all this, and one night I took it out to this gazebo. There was this gazebo in the middle of the yard, this expansive mental facility. And I wandered out into the yard, and there was this gazebo out there. And I went out there, and I sat down, and the sun was going down, and I started to pray, really for the first time. And I hit my knees, and I started to pray, and I found myself praying to God. and I said, God, I don't know what's going on. I don't know what you're trying to show me. You keep putting this Jesus in front of me. And if this is true, then show me clearly what this is all about. And I'm not exactly to this day sure what happened, but I had a tremendous spiritual experience. It's kind of like that dramatic spiritual experience that we read in the Big Book.
Sure.
Right? That immediate flash.
The lightning bolt.
That
yeah.
lightning bolt struck me so hard.
Tell me about it, man. I've had, that's how I describe mine.
Yeah.
I want to hear the details.
You know,
What did it feel like? Where were you? Well, you were in the gazebo.
I was in the gazebo. It struck me like a lightning bolt. And all I can say is, you know, I've spent my whole life chasing after joy and happiness and contentment and peace, because I feel like my whole life I've lived in a place of just a place of discontent and irritability, right? And uncomfortable in my own skin. And so this thought of peace and joy and happiness that you hear in the church, and even that you hear in the 12-step program, was so foreign to me. I didn't know what that meant, and I surely didn't know what it felt like. But I'll tell you, when that lightning bolt went straight through me, I can't explain why, but I can explain how it felt. And literally speaking, for 3 days, I felt the deepest sense of joy and peace and serenity that I've ever felt in my entire life. And physically speaking, it felt like my feet were never touching the ground. It felt like for 3 days I was floating. Complete euphoria. And that's the only way I can describe this. That's the only way I can describe it. It's something I've never felt before. I never felt before that, and I've never felt it since. And that created a dramatic change in my thinking, in my behavior. It was a tremendous sense of hope. And from that moment forward, I took the copy of the Bible that Tio had given me and was always trying to get me to read, and I took that book and I devoured it from cover to cover. And that was the first time, you know, I would go back to my at that time in the place where the transitional place where we were living. We lived in a dorm, so we had our bed and we had a single locker, and everything we owned was in that space. So it was very institutionalized. So I was living like, you know, like a Spartan, you know, this kind of Spartan conditions, right? And I had this Bible, and I would go back to my bed and I would devour the book over and over again. And that's the first time. And I began to pray on my knees. And that was the first time the thought came in my mind, I want to be a pastor. Someday I'm going to be a pastor. I want to preach this gospel.
Wow.
I want to deliver this message of peace and hope, joy, happiness. And I took that with me from the transitional place that I was in. And then I took that out into the world. Went back to college, went through college, university, graduate school, and so that's the experience of that religious, that spiritual lightning bolt. That you've probably had that same experience.
I had the same kind, and it was I was on a run near my home, 7-mile run. I know it was 7 miles because I had the same route that I did about every day, and I used to run a lot. And I was about 4 miles in, and I had this overwhelming sensation come over me, and like the best way to describe it is viscerally, you know, the actual physical sensation.
Yeah.
There was more to it than that, but that's the only part that's really describable. And so it was like wind and light and chills, and I felt like I could laugh and cry at the same time. Like that's kind of the hallmark that distinguishes it from every other similar experience I've had, is that sensation of like extreme joy that made me want to just bubble up in laughter and tears and emotion and all that kind of stuff. And I saw visions, and I had just all these really overpowering emotions and thoughts. And when it was over, I knew 5 things for sure. Like, I knew the sun was going to come up. I knew everything was going to be okay no matter what.
Yep.
I knew that we're all connected in ways I'd never completely understand, humanity, people. I knew that I had a purpose, because I was real worried about that I had no purpose.
Exactly.
And I knew that whatever it was I was experiencing was not mine to keep, that, like, at best I was just a channel for it, right? And then the last thing is that I knew it was okay, and I knew that it was appropriate to let go of the garbage, man. The stuff we just carry with us, the hate and resentment and anger and fear and all that garbage. I knew it was okay to let go. And even when I pick it back up, I know I can set it back down.
Yes.
And that was my lightning bolt experience. And I never tell this part. I always listen to headphones when I run.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I can't run without music,
Yeah.
Or at least I don't think I can, because I never have. I was listening to James Brown's Hot Pants. So Hot Pants is going on in my ears. James Brown.
Nice. Nice.
Yeah, not a very spiritual song.
Oh,
But it's I love James Brown.
James Brown's got the groove, man.
Yeah, I love James Brown, and that was the context for that experience. It was pretty awesome.
Really? You think James Brown had anything to do with that?
It's good stuff, man. He's the godfather of soul, right? Or
Exactly.
yeah. I had this mix, this like track or not a tape, but playlist
Yeah.
that I listened to, and that one was on there, and it was overwhelming. I was never the same since
Yeah.
that moment, and I wasn't religious at the time. Like, it was only. That was June, and it was May of the following year, so it was like 10, 11 months until I had a call into ministry, or what started a call into ministry, which was really strange. So I had those kind of as 2 separate moments. Your spiritual experience kind of was, the spiritual experience we talk about in recovery, and a call to ministry all wrapped together.
Yeah.
And then it took, I guess, 20 years or whatever to unfold. Or
It did, yeah. And by the way, I can identify with that visceral experience, because
Mm-hmm.
it was a visceral, physical experience, and that's what made it so real. It's like you could taste it in your mouth, right? And that
Oh, yeah.
and that wanting to laugh and cry at the same time, and which, by the way, reminds me of the birth of the disciples, right?
Yeah.
In the Second Great Awakening, right, where people were going out into the woods and they were having these spiritual experiences. I think the disciples are born out of that
Yeah, very.
kind of that lightning bolt experience, where people were crying and weeping and repenting, and the historical documents say that they were barking and
And so,
singing out, and crying out.
And what's interesting, right, is that, we come from a tradition that's a wide tent.
Yeah.
The Barton Stone, Alexander Campbell, Walter Scott, all those guys, that movement has since become this tradition and that tradition and that tradition and so forth. And we are probably in the most vanilla,
Yeah,
the
exactly.
very mainline Protestant
Exactly.
of those. And yet, nonetheless, we come from an ecstatic tradition.
We do.
We come from a tradition of people barking like dogs.
We do.
Rolling on the ground.
And sometimes I think we forget that
Yeah.
that we come from a charismatic movement.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we always need to remind ourselves that we have those charismatic roots.
Mm-hmm.
Because for me, that experience that I had in the gazebo was tremendously charismatic, right? And euphoric and religious and spiritual.
So what do you think that's all about? Like, I'd like to take this turn into the spirituality part of it, not necessarily connected to recovery or addiction. Maybe there's some places where we can jump back into that stream, but like, what's that all about? Like, why do we have those? Why do certain people have those? What does it mean? What's the difference between those kinds of experiences and the every Sunday for 40 years sitting in the pew kind of experiences? Like, what is that all about?
Yeah, and
How does it fit together?
And are they necessary?
Right. Yeah.
Right.
Like, I don't think of myself as better because I've had it. It's just
No.
it happened.
But
right?
it certainly happened to me, and it was powerful at the time, necessary at the time, because it did have an immediate effect on me, and there was kind of this immediate call of my life that I felt, right? That, that call to ministry wasn't fulfilled for like another 30 years. It took me another 30 years to answer that pastoral call, but that call was established nonetheless, and that came out of that physical, visceral, spiritual experience. How that happens, why that happens, I don't know. It's like I preached a sermon one time on the Wonderwall. Oh, the band Oasis had that song, The Wonderwall. And I saw the Wonderwall as this kind of, sometimes there's this tear in the fabric that separates the spiritual from the mundane. And we're able to see through to the other side, and the other side, through that tear in the Wonderwall, there's this ecstatic connection between the spirit and the mundane. And the end of the sermon suggested that exists at one time in this present moment, right? That the spiritual and the mundane exist, and that connection exists in the here and the now, right? And sometimes I think we forget that because we're so caught up in the mundane and life that we're caught up in this life. You can call it the mundane, and we forget that the mundane and the spirit, which I suggested in my sermon, was that the mundane and the spirit are one and the same. That they're so close, right? That this wonder wall is so thin that they become one and the same. And I think for some reason, somehow, and sometimes for some people, right, there's this kind of static electricity, I don't know, that causes this, spiritual experience to happen, this lightning bolt experience, right? And I don't know why it happened to me.
Something that you said reminds me of, I got this from somebody else. I can't remember exactly. It might have been Sandy B, who is a speaker that you can find recordings of. I think he's since passed away. But one day at a time, right? One day at a time is this phrase that you hear in recovery, which the surface meaning of that is life is easier to manage or to experience or to go through if you just take it in bite-sized pieces. Like, don't try to think about your entire life and like, I got to be sober for the next 40 years. Like, I just can't. It's overwhelming. Well, don't think about it that way. Just think about, okay, just be sober today, get to the end of the day, tomorrow, just worry about tomorrow then. It's practical advice about how to get through difficult things.
Exactly.
There's a spiritual dimension to one day at a time too, which is that God is everything, right? And it says, God is everywhere, God is everything, or God is nothing. What's your choice to be? So if God is everything and if God is everywhere, then that means that God can only be in reality, right? God can't be in fantasy land. Well, what's fantasy land? The future and the past.
Yep.
All that time that we spend worrying about what's going to happen tomorrow, and making up stories in our head about they're going to say this and I'm going to say that, and then we're going to break up, and then I'm going to be broke, and then I'm going to lose my, like all that garbage, and then all of our resentment from the past, and we just live there.
Exactly.
And if we can find our way to get out of the past and the future and
live
come
in the moment.
into the moment, not only is life easier, we find the presence of God, because that's where God is.
And that's where
So it's not just that like it's broken up and therefore it's easier.
Exactly.
It's the power is in the one day at a time too. That's where the power lives.
That's awesome. I've never heard it put like that. I like that.
I wish I was smart enough to figure that out, but man, I heard it and I was like, bingo.
And that's where the serenity lies.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's where the peace and the joy lies.
And there's all kinds of reasons not to come here into the moment. No, I got stuff going on, man. Like, I got to figure that out. Like, you don't understand. Like, I got bills, buddy. Like, I got this relationship I got to fix. I got to think about tomorrow because tomorrow's coming.
And I think most of that time spent in the mundane is spent in the past or the future.
Right.
the majority of our time is, right? But there's always that opportunity, right, to move from that into the present moment. And that's where I think the possibility, right? Every moment in the present, right, is that possibility for that peace and joy to happen, that spiritual moment to happen, those lightning bolt moments. And the lightning bolt moments don't need to be like what I experienced in the gazebo.
Well, maybe what you mean, or what you could also mean, or maybe is what you're indicating by the mundane and the spiritual being the same thing, is that the reason that would be hard to believe is because we think, well, I'm in the mundane all the time, and that sure doesn't seem spiritual. The problem is your preconception is wrong. You're not in the mundane. You're not in reality. You're in the past and the future. But if you leave the past and the future, your imaginary past and future, and because the real past and future is inaccessible, right? It's gone. It ain't here yet. Like you can't be in the real one. So if you leave Fantasyland and you come into reality, which is mundane, that's our interface. Because it's reality, it is indistinguishable from the spirituality. It's indistinguishable from that spiritual experience. And sometimes it's ecstatic, and sometimes it's very zen. You know.
Do you think that that's when the book talks about moving into the fourth dimension?
When I read the words, "we've been moved into the fourth dimension," that sure sounds a lot like what I'm talking about to me. Yeah. I can't get into Bill's head, but man, that sure it sure sounds like we're talking about the same thing.
Yeah, or that psychic change that the big book talks about. So
tell me more. So there's a period of time, and then there comes a moment when you act on that call that was put on your life so far in the past.
Yeah, so I
drew you in.
I left that institution, kind of high on Jesus, and was active in the church. The old timers used to tell me, right, that church won't keep you sober, Jesus won't keep you sober, right? The 12-step program will keep you sober. So if you distance yourself from the program, you're going to forget about the reality of your disease, right? You're going to take your power back, right? And you're going to begin to operate again from your own ego. You're going to forget that you're powerless and that your life had become unmanageable. That's what had ended you up in that institution in the first place. You're going to forget all that and you'll drink again. And I said, okay, yeah. And I came out of the institution feeling strong. I was back into school. I was studying. I got my degree, and I was working in the church, and hopped up on Jesus, and for about 10 years I stayed sober. But in that period of time of 10 years, I had a number of these kind of psychotic incidences where I just broke down, like mental collapses, right? I just wasn't taking care of myself, mentally, spiritually, physically. I'd forgotten about my disease, and I specifically remember that in that period of time, I was even angry at the notion of being called an alcoholic. So I took that word altogether and I dismissed it and refused it. I refused to be an alcoholic. I will forever be a normal person.
Just made the decision.
I just made the decision. I remember that distinctly. I hated that word. I'm not going to be known by that. I'm a normal person. I'm going to live my life like everybody else. And I did that. And so there was this, I call it the period of forgetfulness, right? The period of forgetfulness, right? We forget who we are, right? And that's really deeply biblical, by the way, too, right?
Sure.
These periods of forgetfulness, right? And God calls us back to remembrance. My remembrance came in the year 2000, when I was at a party and just wasn't thinking at all. At a party, there was a glass of wine, and I said, hey, there's a glass of wine. Picked it up, took a drink, and my disease kicked in, right? It had been in hibernation for those 10 years, but it had been doing push-ups Like the old timer one time said, your addiction's out in the parking lot doing push-ups waiting for you. It's getting stronger, not weaker. And it was that one drink, and it had been doing push-ups for 10 years and came back that much stronger. And I went on a 20-year run. And towards the end of that, that call at some point towards the end of that call to ministry came back. You know, I went back. In that, once I took that drink, I left the church again, right? And was disgruntled with the church, and that reoccurrence of my disease destroyed my relationship with God. And you know how that disease comes in and just terrorizes everything, terrorized my relationship with God. And I spent a lot of time drinking, and it got worse, never better. And eventually found my way back to the church when I was trying, to curb my drinking. And I would have periods of sobriety and whatnot. But that once I came back to the church, and once I entered the church, and that started to remind me again of that experience that I'd had when I was in my late 20s. And so that came to the forefront again, and sat there, and I began to think about it. And that was about 25, 30 years after the fact. Right? It began to reappear in my life again. And so the more time I spent thinking about that, and then, like I said, I ran into a couple pastors who reminded me of the importance of that call in my life, and affirmed that in my life, right? That made it more real. And so that. From there, I took the next step to directly address that call. But it took time. So my call to ministry was born out of my disease and kind of nurtured through my disease. I don't know. I'll have to think about that more. But my call was always there. I don't think it went anywhere, right? And so today, as I live into this call as a pastor, my disease of addiction and mental health is a part of who I am, but it's also a large part of my call.
Well, let me ask you this question then, because I've always been, not like we've known each other for a long time, but over the last couple of days in all of our conversations, I've been very impressed by your courage to be open on social media and, in more public venues about your journey and about, mental health issues and recovery, addiction and recovery issues. And I think it's important. I'm trying to do the same thing, so I think that's awesome, number one. But I want to know, how do you see that unfolding, or what do you want to accomplish, or what is your wish or your hope by doing that, and making the decision to be public about it?
Yeah, for much of my life I lived not understanding what was going on with me. I've been diagnosed with extreme alcohol use disorder, which is kind of the medical terminology that they use. You can call it alcoholism. On the other side, I've been diagnosed with bipolar on the mental health side, bipolar, and so I'm, but I didn't always understand that about myself. So growing up, when I was young, I do remember, now that I look back on it, being depressed and disconnected from the world and not feeling like I didn't fit in. Always felt the odd man out and didn't know what was going on with me, and I had these feelings that I couldn't explain and nobody else had the answer. So I just kind of cruised through life, and I think my venture into addiction, right, to acting on my addictive behavior and the height of my disease was a way of me trying to always kind of balance, find balance to something that was going on in my head that I couldn't explain, right? So I feel like most of my life I lived in ignorance about what I was feeling inside, what was going on inside. Nobody ever had the answers, and I never sought out help. Because growing up, you know...
And my guess is that that kind of stuff is not natural. You can't just expect that people who are going through that would stumble upon the answers of what the situation is with themselves, or that somebody would just volunteer to tell them, or that you could just intuitively figure it out. So there's not a lot out there to kind of key you in with, man, this is what I'm struggling with. And
Exactly.
This is the kind of thing that it is.
Exactly. I never found that growing up, and even into my adult life. Right?
Wouldn't it be great if churches were equipped to do that?
I think that's what we're getting to. Church.
I sure hope so.
Yeah.
Sure hope so.
It wasn't until my early 40s that I was in my disease, drinking, and sometimes more than not. Some periods of being dry, and then other periods of just being, full blown. And but somewhere in my early 40s, and I didn't know how to explain it. Was it midlife crisis? What was going on? Because I know hormonal development can also affect, your mental state. Mm-hmm. But for some reason, in my early 40s, I just had this tremendous mental pain. Mm-hmm. That I was at the end of my rope, and I have had issues with suicidal ideation. Mm-hmm. Never to the point of planning it out, but just plagued by suicidal, these suicidal thoughts. Mm-hmm. And I was really contemplating suicide. I was at that point. I was married, I had a son, had a career and education, and I was at the end of my rope, and I said, I cannot live like this anymore. And I knew alcohol wasn't solving the problem, it was only making it worse. And so that was the first time I sought out help. And it just so happened that it happened at a time when I changed my insurance company and found myself with a company that had a really strong mental health program and addiction program, addiction medicine and mental health. And so that was the first phone call I made, was to their mental health offices. Mm-hmm. And I booked a therapy appointment, and that therapist sent me to a psychiatrist, and that was the very first time. So it took 40 years of my life, 42, I can't remember the exact age, to be diagnosed with a mental disorder. And that mental disorder was chronic depression. Mm-hmm. And that was the first time that I was medicated. And it made a difference. Mm-hmm. It made a difference. It did. And that was the first time that I felt like, wow, there is an answer to what I have been feeling my whole life. And so that was a really important awakening for me. And
I imagine by being open about that, you're giving other people who are way earlier on their journey that you were on to maybe have the chance of figuring that out a lot earlier on in life if you are able to disclose and share what you've gone through.
Well, I wasn't as open then as I am today, right? That took time.
Right.
But the other problem was that I was drinking on top of that. Mm-hmm. And anybody who has, is dealing with a mental disorder and dealing with any kind of medication knows that alcohol kind of just cancels everything out, right? Mm-hmm. And alcohol is a depressive anyway. So why would you be,
self-medication?
Self-medicate, but you've got depression, but you're taking an antidepressant, right? And it just makes matters worse. So eventually that led me into another psychotic break, which ultimately led me into a second mental diagnosis, which was bipolar disorder, and then on the addiction side led me into recovery. And so that's in that process I found that there had to be this balance for myself, not everybody, but this balance between my mental health disorder and my addiction disorder. and so those kind of those two go hand in hand.
Mm-hmm.
So I consider myself as dual diagnosed. But wasn't always. I remember the first steps I took to be open with my mental health issues was when, for all reasons, when Robin Williams passed away.
Mm.
You know, this iconic figure, and he passed away, and I was so pissed because I was hearing people share about, oh my God, he died, and you know, I never saw this coming, and how could he do that? And I thought, and in the back of my mind, I'm going, why is this surprise everybody? Why are we surprised by this?
Mm-hmm.
You know, this happens every day. People live in silence every day. People take their lives every single day. They die in silence, at the hands of silence, right?
Mm-hmm.
And Robin Williams is a public figure. We didn't clearly know what he was dealing with, right? And suddenly, you know, he's gone. And I think what I wasn't angry at Robin Williams. I was angry at the disease because it takes so many people. But I was angry at this notion of I was angry at silence. I was angry at the silence that we're forced to live in, the stigma.
Shame, stigma.
The shame, stigma that keeps
Silence.
us in silence. And I was angry. And for the first time, I was outspoken and just put myself out there.
Have you seen any fruits from that?
I have. You know, we have this in our I live in this Tri-City community, and there's this mental health organization called Tri-City Mental Health, right, which provides many wonderful resources for this Tri-City community. And they have a program called Courageous Minds. And I immediately identified with that program and asked to join that program. And we were all trained in putting our story down on paper so that we could share it with others. And so I did that. I was trained in this mental health storytelling. I was trained to tell my story and to be open and outspoken with my story. And we go around to schools and universities and whenever we're asked, and we sit on a panel and we share our story about mental health. It's kind of like, you know, going on a 12-step panel, right?
Mm-hmm.
You tell your story. And so I began to be more and more outspoken about that. And the more and more that I've been outspoken, the more fruits I've seen in the fruits of that are in the people that come up to me unexpectedly and express their thanks, and then share openly with me about their experience and connection to a mental health disorder that maybe they live with, or that they're connected to, you know, with family or spouse. And that's powerful.
Mm-hmm.
It's like every time I've opened myself up, it's allowed someone else to open themselves up.
Wow.
Maybe not publicly, but at least they open themselves up to me. Maybe I planted the seed, and it will help them to be more open about their. But every time I've opened myself up, it's helped someone else open up and feel better about who they are as a human being. Right? This is who I am. This is the whole me. Take it or leave it, right? But this is who I am, and this is what I live with on a daily basis, and this is how I manage that. And there's hope in that. As a pastor, you know, my last experience with addiction and mental health led me in a mental collapse within ministry. Just, you know, drove myself into the ground. took my mental health and my addictive disease for granted, and just led to just a mental collapse that I didn't see coming. It was embarrassing because I had to live through that.
And was your church community witness to all of this?
My colleagues, the two colleagues that I work with were.
How did they respond?
I was open and frank with them
Mm-hmm.
because I ended up in the hospital. I couldn't. You can't hide that.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, my family was there, surrounding me, and the second people that I told were my two colleagues, which we have a very loving relationship.
So they were supportive, and
They were tremendously supportive.
that's awesome.
That's changed the nature and the shape of our ministry together and our relationship together. And then, of course, there's reluctance and shame around that as to how far you want that to spread of what's happened. And I decided that, to build on that openness that I had professed before, that I'm going to be brutally honest. And I'm going to make this journey back to wholeness public. I'm not going to hide it. And in the back of my mind, I was so scared.
Do you feel like your recovery depends upon it?
It does. It does. My instinct was to hide it, to try to hide it, because that's my nature. I'm that kind of alcoholic who doesn't like to tell the truth, who hides everything.
I'd lie about everything.
Who drinks behind closed doors, right?
That was my life, man. I hear you.
I hid in the dark, and my drinking and using was done in the dark, and that's my MO, man. And if I find myself in that place, that's my vulnerable place. That's a dangerous place for me. And I felt like the only way that I can combat that instinct to want to withdraw and hide was to be brutally honest. Because the more brutally honest I was, and the more people knew who I was and what I was going through, it was a liberating experience, for one, because I wasn't hiding anything.
I feel like it's like sabotaging that part of you that wants to hide.
It's sabotaging that part because now everybody knows, and I can't go back.
You can't unring a bell.
And it also has something to do with accountability. Because part of the reason why I hide is because I don't want to be held accountable. I do not want to be held accountable. So my whole disease was spent avoiding accountability. And as long as I'm not accountable to anyone, then I can move and do whatever I want to do, right?
And ironically, so it feels like we do that to maintain some kind of freedom, but ironically, it's being brutally honest and disarming one's worst nature and sabotaging that part of ourself that leads to a different, a truer, and a better freedom.
Yep, exactly. So I made the decision to be brutally honest, first to my family, to my colleagues, and then to my congregation. And I took a leave of absence. From the nonprofit that we run, and did the work that I needed to do, and then slowly made my way back. Preached a couple sermons that were very brutally honest, expressing my experience and my story, right? My past story, and so that everybody knew that this is who I am and this is what I live with, and so that there's no questions, right? And I feel that has off, and so I was also very public on social media, and I again felt the sense of guilt and shame in the background. And should I be doing this? And am I just tooting my own horn? Am I fishing for pity? You know, but I felt led to share my story back, my healing story back, you know, into recovery. I just felt that was important, and I did. Every day I posted, right, snippets of my progress, right? And that received a response. You know, of course, likes and comments, but it was the private messages that meant a lot to me.
Man, well, that's a good segue for the last thing I want to ask, which is, if people watching this want to just know more about you, like in the mission that you're involved in your church and congregation, your ministry, or if people want to be able to contact you through social media, how would they be able to do that?
Well, they can contact me personally on Facebook.
Okay.
I'm on Facebook under Stephen Yorba.
Stephen Yorba,
Stephen,
Stephen
Yorba, Yorba. On Instagram, I'm at Punk Theologian.
At Punk Theologian.
Punk Theologian.
Awesome.
Yeah. And so you can find me personally there. The ministry that I'm a part of is called Urban Mission. Our church is Urban Mission.
Urban Mission.
Urban Mission. You can find us on Facebook. And the nonprofit that we've established that's represented here at GA is Urban Mission Community Partners.
Urban Mission Community Partners.
And you can also find us as Urban Mission Community Partners on Facebook.
And you're in Pomona, California.
We are in Pomona, California. Yeah, so we're easy to find on social media. I think we have Instagram for those, but I'm not too sure about that. But I know you can find us on Facebook.
Amen.
Yep.
Well, this has been a good conversation, man.
And if anybody wants to reach out to me personally, I mean, feel free.
Yeah.
You know,
I would encourage it.
I'm open to talking, and
I can tell you, after spending the last couple of days with you, you're a great person to talk to, easy person to talk to, relatable and open and honest. You know, so that makes a good conversation partner. So I encourage anyone.
Yeah, and I'm really thankful that I met you here at GA, man. You've got a lot of wisdom, and we've got to hang out for a few days and go to meetings, and
we're gonna do another one tonight.
We are 7:00.
Yeah, and Des Moines 12-step, so far so good. I give it 2 enthusiastic thumbs up.
Great job, Des Moines.
Yeah,
They're doing some good sobriety out here.
Amen. All right, brother. Well, I appreciate the conversation.
All right, Joey.
And my name is Joe Pusateri, and I'm living the sober life.
Stephen Patten, living the sober life with Joey here.
Amen.
Thanks for having us.
See you later.
Awesome.
We are recording. I think we look good in the camera.
Yep.
What do you say? You ready?
Ready?
All right, let's do it.